A black doctor, exhausted after a 16-hour shift saving lives, heads to the airport to catch a long overdue flight home. But as he waits at the boarding gate, a racist flight attendant singles him out, accusing him of forging his ticket. What happens next escalates into a public spectacle that leaves the entire terminal stunned. Just 7 minutes later, the flight attendant is escorted away, her career in shambles, as the truth about the doctor's identity comes to light. What unfolds next sets off a wave of consequences no one could have anticipated. Stay with me, because this story will challenge everything you thought you knew. Before we dive into the details, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you. Don't forget to subscribe for more eye-opening narratives. The plane sat on the tarmac, its engines humming a low, steady rhythm that matched the pulse of anticipation in the cabin. Ava Mitchell, poised yet weary, made her way down the aisle, the designer laptop bag on her shoulder a silent testament to her hard-won success. The air inside the plane felt crisp and cold, like the sterile chill of a courtroom where she spent most of her days. Every step she took felt purposeful, though her body betrayed a deeper fatigue, a heaviness she had long learned to carry without complaint. Ava's first-class seat was a small luxury she rarely afforded herself. To the outside world, it might seem frivolous, but for Ava, it was a reminder of what she had fought for: the ability to exist in spaces that weren't designed for someone like her. She slid her bag under the seat, her movements deliberate and careful. With a practiced smile, she greeted the attendant offering pre-flight drinks and leaned back, letting the quiet hum of the engines lull her into a rare moment of calm. But the calm didn't last long. A voice cut through the delicate quiet. "Excuse me, ma'am, may I see your ticket?" Ava opened her eyes to find a flight attendant standing before her. Rachel Turner, the name etched neatly on the badge pinned to her starched uniform, leaned slightly forward. Her tone was polished, but there was a tautness beneath it, a sharp edge that Ava recognized instantly. It wasn't the first time she had heard a voice like that. A voice that managed to demand proof while feigning politeness. Ava handed over her ticket without hesitation. Rachel studied it for longer than necessary, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Ah," Rachel said finally, handing it back, "just making sure. Sometimes passengers get confused about their seats." Ava didn't miss the way Rachel's eyes flicked over her, a quick assessment. Subtle but deliberate. "I'm not confused," Ava replied evenly. "This is the seat I paid for." "Of course," Rachel said, with a smile so tight it might have shattered. As she turned away, Ava caught the muttered words, soft, almost inaudible, but sharp enough to slice through the noise of the cabin. "First class isn't what it used to be." Ava inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the armrest. She had learned, over decades, the art of picking her battles. Not everything deserved a response, and not every insult needed confrontation. Instead, she let her attention drift to her phone, scanning through the unread emails piling up before her upcoming trial, a major civil rights case that could set a precedent for years to come. She tried to focus, but the hum of the engines was now accompanied by the unmistakable weight of unwelcome stares. It wasn't just Rachel. She felt it in the way the man across the aisle lowered his newspaper, his gaze lingering a beat too long, or the way the couple one row behind her spoke in hushed tones. Their words indistinct but their disapproval palpable. It was a quiet kind of hostility, woven into the fabric of daily life, the kind that didn't yell or shove but whispered and dismissed, leaving no marks yet cutting just as deeply. When the flight attendant returned with refreshments, Ava noticed the pause. Rachel handed drinks to the man next to her first, then the couple behind her. When Ava caught her eye, Rachel hesitated, then moved on without a word. The silence spoke volumes. As the plane began its taxi down the runway, Ava settled back into her seat. She told herself she was imagining things, that it was too easy to read into every slide. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't new, it was just louder here. In this small, enclosed space where class divisions were literal, delineated by rows of plush seats in the front and cramped quarters in the back. 15 minutes into the flight, Rachel returned. Her clipboard was gripped tightly in her hands, her expression tense but carefully controlled. "Ma'am," she said, her voice louder now, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "I need to speak to you about your seat." Ava straightened, her posture as firm as her voice. Is there a problem? There seems to have been a mix-up, Rachel said, her words clipped. This seat may not be assigned to you. The murmurs started immediately. A man in the next row adjusted his glasses. Glancing over at Ava, the couple behind her whispered again, their voices low but audible enough to sting. Ava stayed calm, her voice steady as she replied, "This is the seat I booked. If there's a mistake, it's not mine to fix." Rachel's face tightened. "We'd like to resolve this quietly," she said, leaning in slightly. "I'm sure you'd prefer not to make a scene." It was a statement laced with a quiet threat. The kind of warning Ava had heard 100 times before. Her mind flicked back to moments from her childhood diner counters that didn't serve her family. Classrooms where her intelligence was questioned. Streets where her presence was scrutinized. Those memories lived just beneath the surface, rising now like smoke from an old fire. "I'm not making a scene," Ava replied, her voice low but firm. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for." The tension between them was thick enough to taste. Around them, the passengers watched, their silence complicit. Rachel straightened, her jaw tight as she turned and walked briskly down the aisle. Ava exhaled, but the weight in her chest didn't ease. She knew this wasn't over. It never was. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Ava could feel the eyes of the cabin on her. Some passengers watched with curiosity, others with pity, but what stung most were the stares of disdain, the ones that asked, without words, what someone like her was doing there. Ava leaned back and closed her eyes, determined not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her crack. This was just another flight, she told herself, just another battle in a lifetime of them. But even as the engines droned on, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. The air inside the plane had thickened. Not in any tangible way, no change in the temperature. No turbulence to rattle the cabin, but in the weight of unspoken words and unacknowledged glances. Ava Mitchell sat still in her seat, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. On the surface, she exuded composure, but inside, a storm churned. She had been here before, not on this flight, not in this exact moment, but in this space of suspended tension, where every interaction felt loaded with meaning unspoken. It was a lifetime of navigating around hostility cloaked in politeness, of standing firm against indignities dressed as mistakes. Rachel Turner reappeared, clipboard in hand, her smile thin and strained. This time, she wasn't alone. A younger flight attendant trailed behind her, her expression uneasy, as if she'd rather be anywhere else. "Ma'am," Rachel began, her voice louder than before, as if volume could mask the sharpness of her words. "I've double-checked our records, and there's definitely been a mix-up with your seat. I'll need you to move to the main cabin." Ava didn't move. She didn't even blink. "There's been no mix-up," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This is the seat I was assigned. I'm not moving." Rachel's smile faltered, her professional veneer cracking ever so slightly. "I'm sure we can resolve this quickly if you cooperate," she said, leaning closer. "I'm only trying to do my job. And I'm trying to enjoy the seat I paid for." Ava replied evenly. "If there's an issue, I suggest you take it up with your airline. I'm not responsible for your mistakes." The murmurs began again, soft at first but growing louder. Passengers in the surrounding rows shifted in their seats, their curiosity barely concealed. Some leaned toward each other, whispering behind hands and magazines, while others openly stared. Ava felt their eyes on her, each glance a question, an accusation, or worse, a silent agreement with Rachel. The younger flight attendant took a step forward, her voice tentative. "Maybe we should check with the captain." Rachel cut her off with a sharp glance. "That won't be necessary," she said, her tone brittle. Ava arched an eyebrow. "Perhaps it should be," she said. "In fact, I'd be happy to speak with the captain myself. Let's make sure we resolve this thoroughly." Rachel's face reddened, a flush creeping up her neck. Her fingers tightened around the clipboard, the plastic creaking under the pressure. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. Then, her voice dropped to a near whisper, her tone laced with venom. "People like you always make things harder than they need to be." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. They landed not just on Ava but on every passenger who had been listening. A man in the row ahead stiffened, his tablet lowering to his lap. A woman across the aisle gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest. Ava felt the words settle in her stomach, a familiar weight she had carried before. "People like me?" Ava said, her voice calm but razor sharp. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking onto Rachel's. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Rachel's eyes widened, panic flickering across her face before it hardened into defiance. "I didn't mean," she started. But Ava cut her off. "You didn't have to mean it," Ava said, her voice rising just enough to carry across the cabin. "You've made it perfectly clear." The murmurs grew louder, rippling through the cabin like an undercurrent. The tension that had been simmering now boiled over, spilling into every corner of the first-class section. Ava could feel the shift, the way the atmosphere turned electric with possibility. Some passengers looked away, their discomfort palpable. Others watched intently, their expressions unreadable. From the back of the cabin, a new voice broke through the noise. "She's right." It was a woman seated 2 rows behind Ava, her tone calm but firm. "I've been watching the whole time. You've been targeting her since she boarded." Rachel spun around, her composure unraveling. "This has nothing to do with anyone else," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "I'm simply following procedure." The woman didn't back down. "Is muttering about her under your breath part of your procedure?" she asked, her voice cutting through the cabin like a blade. A ripple of agreement swept through the passengers, their murmurs now more vocal. Ava remained seated, her eyes steady on Rachel. But inside, her heart pounded. She had stood her ground before, but rarely had she seen others take up the fight alongside her. It was both empowering and unsettling, a reminder of the power of collective action, but also of the fragility of her position. Rachel straightened, her smile now a thin mask stretched over her growing anger. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she said sharply, her gaze darting from the woman to Ava. "I'm just doing my job. And I'm just sitting in my seat." Ava replied, "So, if you're done harassing me, I'd like to enjoy the rest of my flight." The younger flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flicking between Rachel and Ava. She looked as though she wanted to speak but didn't dare. Ava caught her eye, the unspoken plea for courage passing between them. But the woman quickly looked away. Rachel hesitated, her grip tightening on the clipboard. For a moment, it seemed as though she might back down. But then, with a final glare, she turned sharply and walked briskly toward the galley. The sound of her heels clicking against the floor echoed through the cabin, a staccato beat that marked her retreat. The silence that followed was deafening. Ava sat back in her seat, her breath steady but shallow. Around her, the passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers filling the void left by Rachel's departure. Some looked at Ava with sympathy, others with discomfort, and a few with open disdain. But Ava didn't care. She wasn't here to make anyone comfortable. She was here to exist, to occupy the space she had earned, to take up the room that was rightfully hers. And that, she realized, was its own quiet revolution. In a world that demanded she shrink, she chose instead to remain seated, unbowed and unbroken. The hum of the engines grew louder, a background roar that seemed to underscore the tension now vibrating through the cabin. Ava Mitchell remained in her seat, her posture upright, her hands resting calmly on her knees. Outwardly, she was a picture of composure. But the sharp undercurrent of humiliation, indignation, and weariness coursed through her like a river running beneath frozen ground. The passengers around her had fallen silent, but their stares lingered, heavy with unspoken judgments. Some looked away quickly when she met their eyes, guilt flickering across their faces like fleeting shadows. Others let their gazes rest on her too long, their expressions unreadable but charged with the weight of things they wouldn't say out loud. Ava felt their scrutiny like a steady pressure on her chest, but she refused to shrink beneath it. The silence broke with the crisp, rhythmic clicks of Rachel Turner's heels as she marched back into the cabin. She moved with forced authority, the kind that barely concealed fraying nerves. A younger flight attendant trailed behind her, her discomfort even more apparent now. Rachel stopped abruptly in front of Ava, her clipboard clutched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "We need to address this situation now," Rachel said, her voice louder than it needed to be. "It's becoming a disruption to the entire cabin." Ava arched an eyebrow, her calm gaze meeting Rachel's. "The only disruption here is your behavior," she said evenly. "I'm seated where I belong. That hasn't changed." Rachel's lips tightened into a thin line, her professional mask slipping further. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice sharp. "It's about procedure. And I'm asking you one last time to cooperate." Ava tilted her head slightly. Studying Rachel. And if I don't? She asked. Her voice calm but pointed. The question hung in the air, daring Rachel to answer it. For a moment, the flight attendant faltered, her eyes darting toward the younger woman for support. But when she found none, her face hardened. Then I'll escalate this to the captain, Rachel said, her tone clipped, as if the words themselves were a weapon. Go ahead, Ava replied. She gestured toward the cockpit door with a slow, deliberate movement. Bring him here. I'd love to hear what he has to say. Rachel hesitated, visibly thrown by Ava's unflinching composure. Around them, the murmurs of the passengers grew louder. A man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Ava and Rachel like someone caught between two forces he didn't want to reckon with. A woman a few rows back leaned toward her seatmate, whispering loudly enough to be overheard. This is what happens when you let just anyone buy a first-class ticket, the woman said, her words dripping with contempt. Ava turned her head sharply, her gaze locking onto the woman. Excuse me? She said, her voice cutting through the rising noise in the cabin. The woman stiffened, her cheeks flushing. I didn't mean, she stammered. But Ava cut her off. You didn't mean for me to hear it? Ava asked, her tone calm but laced with steel. Or you didn't mean to say it out loud? The woman faltered, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for an escape. She glanced around the cabin, but no one came to her defense. The moment stretched unbearably, the weight of Ava's question hanging heavy in the air. Before the woman could muster a response, Rachel cleared her throat loudly, drawing the attention back to herself. This isn't productive, she said, her voice strained. I'll get the captain. She spun on her heel and marched toward the cockpit, leaving the younger flight attendant standing awkwardly beside Ava's seat. The woman looked down, avoiding Ava's eyes, her discomfort palpable. Ava studied her for a moment, then spoke quietly. You don't have to follow her lead. You know, Ava said, her voice low but steady. The woman's eyes flicked up to meet Ava's, guilt flashing across her face. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she nodded slightly, then hurried away down the aisle. Ava leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. Around her, the cabin buzzed with uneasy murmurs. Some passengers spoke in hushed tones, their words indistinct but weighted. Others glanced at Ava, their expressions ranging from pity to discomfort to quiet admiration. The tension in the air felt thick enough to choke on, but Ava refused to let it pull her under. She had been here before in spaces where she wasn't wanted, where her presence was questioned, where every glance and every word carried the weight of centuries of unspoken bias. This was nothing new, and yet, it still stung. Minutes passed before Rachel returned, this time with the captain in tow. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair and a weariness in his eyes that suggested he had dealt with one too many in-flight disputes. He stopped in front of Ava's seat, his expression neutral but his posture stiff. What seems to be the issue here? He asked, his tone calm but laced with impatience. Rachel launched into her explanation, her words rehearsed and polished. She framed Ava as uncooperative, emphasizing her refusal to comply with standard procedures. The captain listened silently, his gaze shifting between Rachel and Ava. When Rachel finished, Ava spoke, her voice calm but unwavering. Captain, I'm sitting in the seat I purchased. Your flight attendant has targeted me from the moment I boarded. Her behavior has been discriminatory, and I won't tolerate it. The captain's brow furrowed as he looked to the surrounding passengers. Can anyone corroborate this? He asked, his tone cautious. Several heads nodded, and a man in the row behind Ava spoke up. She's telling the truth. The flight attendant has been singling her out. Rachel's face turned a deep shade of red, her composure crumbling further. She opened her mouth to respond, but the captain held up a hand to silence her. I see, he said, his tone cool. He turned back to Ava, his expression unreadable. Miss Mitchell, I apologize for any misunderstanding. You're welcome to remain in your seat. Rachel stiffened, her hands gripping her clipboard so tightly it looked as though she might snap it in half. But she said nothing. Instead, she turned and marched back toward the galley, her footsteps echoing through the now silent cabin. Ava exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest easing slightly. Around her, the passengers exchanged glances, their murmurs subdued but still present. Some looked at her with quiet approval, while others avoided her gaze altogether. The fault lines of prejudice and power had been exposed, laid bare for everyone to see. But the battle wasn't over, not yet. Ava could feel it in the air, a lingering sense of unease that suggested the worst was still to come. She leaned back in her seat, her gaze fixed on the window as the plane continued its journey. The sky stretched endlessly before her, vast and open and impossibly far away. It was a stark contrast to the confined space of the cabin, where centuries of history seemed to press in from every angle, shaping every word, every glance, every interaction. Ava knew this fight wasn't just about her. It was about something far bigger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface of society for generations, waiting for moments like this to break through. And she wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not ever. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind of silence that grows from tension too heavy to ignore but too complex to address directly. Ava Mitchell sat in her first-class seat, her outward composure betraying none of the roiling emotions beneath the surface. She knew the eyes of the other passengers lingered on her, even as they pretended not to. Each glance, each hushed whisper carried a message: curiosity, discomfort, judgment, or solidarity, though solidarity was the rarest of them all. She kept her gaze fixed forward, her breathing measured, but she could feel the battle lines drawn around her, invisible yet palpable, cutting across the boundaries of rows and seats. This wasn't just a dispute over a chair. It never had been. It was about who belonged, who was allowed to occupy certain spaces, and the unspoken rules that dictated such things. Rules that weren't written down but enforced all the same. Ava's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from the galley. When she turned her head, she saw Rachel Turner returning, her clipboard held like a shield and her expression set in a mask of cold determination. Beside her walked the younger flight attendant, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for a storm. The cabin stirred slightly, passengers adjusting in their seats, their attention drawn to the unfolding drama like moths to a flame. Ava noticed one man in a business suit raise his phone, holding it low but angled toward her. Another woman, older with silver-streaked hair, clutched her pearls and whispered furiously to her companion. Rachel stopped in front of Ava, her voice loud enough to command the attention of the entire cabin. "Miss Mitchell, the captain has asked me to ensure all passengers comply with the airline's seating policies. If you continue to refuse to move, I will have no choice but to involve security when we land." A ripple of murmurs passed through the passengers. Ava caught snippets of their words, fragments of opinions that revealed the quiet fractures running through the group. "This is ridiculous," a man muttered, shaking his head. "Just let her stay. Why is she being so difficult?" A woman whispered harshly to her husband. "She's making a scene." Ava turned her attention back to Rachel, her expression calm but unyielding. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for," she said. "If there's an issue, it's not with me." Rachel's jaw tightened, her grip on the clipboard visibly trembling. But it wasn't anger that flickered in her eyes, it was fear. Not the kind of fear born from physical danger, but the deeper, more insidious fear of losing control. Control over the narrative, over the authority she wielded, and over the unspoken hierarchies that had always worked in her favor. "You people always turn everything into a race issue," Rachel hissed under her breath, her voice low but sharp enough for Ava to hear. Ava's chest tightened, the words cutting deep despite her practiced defenses. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto Rachel's with an intensity that made the younger flight attendant flinch. "What exactly do you mean by, you people?" Ava asked, her voice calm but slicing through the cabin like a blade. Rachel's face flushed crimson, her composure crumbling. "I didn't mean," she stammered. But Ava didn't let her finish. "Yes, you did," Ava said, her tone steady but heavy with the weight of all the times she had been forced to confront this exact moment in other forms. "You meant exactly what you said. And everyone here heard it." The cabin erupted into a low murmur, passengers glancing at each other with wide eyes. Some nodded quietly in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying their desire to remain uninvolved. The older woman with the silver-streaked hair stood suddenly, her voice clear and resolute. "She's right," the woman said, her tone cutting through the rising noise. "We've all been watching this unfold. And it's clear what's happening here. This flight attendant has been targeting her since she boarded." Rachel spun around to face the woman. her eyes wide with a mixture of anger and panic. "Ma'am, I'm simply following. Don't you dare," the woman interrupted, her voice sharp with indignation. "Don't you dare hide behind protocol. We've all heard your muttered comments. We've all seen the way you've singled her out. This has nothing to do with seating policies. And you know it." The murmurs swelled into a wave of agreement. Passengers speaking up now in bolder tones. A man a few rows back called out, "Yeah, we heard it too. This is wrong." Rachel's confidence faltered, the weight of the growing dissent pressing down on her like a physical force. She turned to the younger flight attendant for support, but the woman looked down, avoiding her gaze. Ava watched it all unfold, her heart pounding but her face impassive. She had fought this fight before, but never with an audience willing to step into the fray alongside her. It was both empowering and unsettling, a reminder of how rare such moments were. Rachel's voice cracked as she addressed the captain, who had re-entered the cabin during the commotion. "Captain, I." The captain held up a hand, silencing her. His gaze moved to Ava, then to the passengers around her. "It's clear there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone measured but weary. "Miss Mitchell, I apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced. You are welcome to remain in your seat." Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but the captain's sharp glance silenced her. She stepped back, her shoulders slumping as the reality of her defeat sank in. The tension in the cabin began to ease, the passengers settling back into their seats with murmured comments and quiet nods of approval. Ava exhaled slowly, her hands relaxing their grip on the armrests. She met the gaze of the older woman who had spoken up, offering a small nod of gratitude. But as the plane continued its journey through the sky, Ava knew this wasn't over. The battle had shifted, but it hadn't ended. The tension in the air was still there, quieter now but lingering like the distant rumble of a coming storm. And Ava was ready for it. The cabin felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. The confrontation had subsided for now, but the air still carried the faint charge of unresolved tension. Ava Mitchell sat rooted in her seat, her fingers tracing the edges of her armrest. She could hear the faint murmur of passengers around her, voices too low to catch fully but laced with judgment, curiosity, or quiet agreement. Every glance that landed on her felt heavier now, charged with the weight of unspoken questions. Why didn't she just move? Why does she insist on making this about race? Why won't she let it go? Ava didn't look up. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her waver. But her mind churned, the steady rhythm of her thoughts punctuated by flashes of memory. The first time she was told she didn't belong. The job interviews where her name alone sparked hesitation. The countless times she had been asked to prove her right to exist in spaces that others moved through without question. The fight was always there, lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life, waiting for moments like this to rise up and remind her that nothing, not even a first-class ticket, could shield her from it. The flight attendant, Rachel Turner, had retreated to the galley, her footsteps heavy and deliberate, but Ava could still feel her presence, like a shadow cast over the cabin. She wasn't gone, she was regrouping. Ava knew this wasn't the end of it. She had seen people like Rachel before. People who hid behind rules and procedures to justify their bias, who doubled down on their authority when challenged. And she knew that when they lost control, they lashed out. It didn't take long for Rachel to reappear, her composure visibly fraying. She marched down the aisle, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning the cabin like a predator searching for an opening. When she reached Ava's seat, she stopped abruptly, her smile so forced it looked more like a grimace. "Miss Mitchell," Rachel said, her voice tight and clipped. "The captain has asked me to remind all passengers to comply with crew instructions for the safety of everyone on board." Ava didn't look up. "I am complying," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. "I'm sitting in my assigned seat." Rachel's jaw tightened. "This isn't about the seat anymore," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. "It's about your behavior. You're creating a hostile environment for other passengers." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Ava finally raised her head, meeting Rachel's gaze with a steady intensity. "I'm creating a hostile environment?" she asked, her voice low but razor sharp. "By refusing to accept your prejudice?" The cabin fell silent. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen now turned openly, their expressions ranging from shock to discomfort to quiet approval. Ava's words seemed to echo in the stillness, cutting through the pretense that this was just a misunderstanding. Rachel faltered, her face flushing. She opened her mouth to respond but was interrupted by a voice from the back of the cabin. "This is unacceptable," said Michael Rivera, a coach passenger who had been filming the incident on his phone. He stood now, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the rising tension like a beacon. "We've all seen what's happening here. You're targeting her, plain and simple." Rachel turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Sir, this is none of your concern," she said, her tone brittle. "I suggest you return to your seat. It's everyone's concern." Michael shot back, his phone still pointed at her. "And I've got it all on video. You're going to have to answer for this." Rachel's face drained of color. She glanced around the cabin, her eyes darting from Michael to the passengers who were now murmuring louder, their voices rising in a wave of agreement. The balance of power had shifted, and Rachel felt it slipping further out of her grasp. Ava watched the scene unfold, a flicker of gratitude rising in her chest. She hadn't asked for an ally, but Michael's intervention felt like a lifeline in the middle of a storm. She turned her gaze back to Rachel, her expression steady. "This could have ended hours ago," Ava said quietly. "You made the choice to escalate it." Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line, her composure cracking further. "I'll be speaking with the captain," she said stiffly, spinning on her heel and disappearing down the aisle. As soon as she was gone, the cabin erupted into whispers, passengers leaning toward each other to discuss what they had just witnessed. Ava could hear snippets of their conversation, some supportive, others critical. "She's just standing her ground," a woman said, her tone indignant. "But why does it have to be about race?" another man muttered. "Why can't it just be a misunderstanding?" Ava closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. The murmurs weren't new, they were part of the rhythm of these battles. The way people rationalized or dismissed what made them uncomfortable. But she couldn't focus on them now. There were bigger stakes here than the opinions of a few strangers. Minutes later, the captain appeared, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. He approached Ava's seat with deliberate calm, his voice measured as he addressed her. "Miss Mitchell," he began, "I understand there's been some tension during this flight. I'd like to resolve this peacefully." Ava raised an eyebrow. "Peacefully?" she echoed. "By asking me to move from the seat I paid for?" The captain's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced around the cabin, taking in the passengers who were now watching intently. He seemed to realize the weight of the moment, the way every word he spoke would be dissected and remembered. "I'm not asking you to move," he said finally, his voice low, "but I do need your cooperation to ensure the rest of the flight proceeds smoothly." Ava met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "Then I suggest you speak to your flight attendant about what cooperation looks like," she said, "because I'm not the one disrupting this flight." The captain hesitated, the tension in his posture betraying his frustration. But he nodded slowly, stepping back. "Understood," he said, turning and walking away. As the plane settled back into a tense quiet, Ava felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve wash over her. The battle wasn't over, but she had stood her ground. And for now, that was enough. Behind her, Michael Rivera leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You're not alone in this," he said. "We've got your back." Ava turned slightly, offering him a small nod of gratitude. The fight wasn't just hers anymore, it was something larger now. Something that couldn't be ignored. The quiet violence of power and prejudice had been laid bare, and the ripples were already spreading. And Ava was ready for what came next. The air inside the cabin had grown stifling. Despite the steady whir of the plane's ventilation system, the tension was no longer unspoken, it hung thick and undeniable. Like a storm about to break, Ava Mitchell sat upright, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Her body was still, but her mind was racing, weighing every move, every word, and every possibility. She was no stranger to this kind of conflict, the subtle yet sharp edges of power, designed to cut but leave no visible wounds. Yet this moment felt heavier, more charged, as if decades of buried history were rising to the surface all at once. Rachel Turner's voice sliced through the quiet. She had returned to the aisle, her tone sharp but fraying at the edges. "Miss Mitchell," she said, her words loud enough to command attention. "The captain has authorized me to inform you that, should this disruption continue, security will meet you upon landing." Ava turned her head slowly, her gaze steady as it met Rachel's. She could see the cracks in Rachel's facade, the way her composure wavered under the weight of public scrutiny. This wasn't just about enforcing airline policies anymore, it was about salvaging control. About asserting dominance in a situation that had spiraled far beyond Rachel's grasp. "I see," Ava said, her voice calm but deliberate. "So, we've gone from asking me to move to threatening me. Is that the official policy of this airline?" Rachel flinched, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's not a threat," she said quickly, though the words rang hollow. "It's a matter of safety." "Safety," Ava repeated, the word heavy with irony. She let it linger in the air, daring anyone listening to reconcile Rachel's claim with the reality of what had unfolded. "I wonder whose safety you're protecting." The murmurs started again, louder this time. Passengers exchanged glances, their whispers charged with a mix of disbelief, anger, and discomfort. A middle-aged man in the row behind Ava leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "This is getting ridiculous," he said, loud enough for Rachel to hear. "She's done nothing wrong." Rachel's eyes darted toward the man, her composure slipping further. "Sir, I understand your concern," she said tightly, "but I need to ensure all passengers are comfortable." "Comfortable?" a woman across the aisle said, her tone incredulous. "You think this is making anyone comfortable? You're the one causing a scene." Rachel's face flushed, her hands gripping the edges of her clipboard so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The murmurs swelled into a wave of discontent. Passengers no longer content to watch in silence. Voices rose in scattered protests, their words echoing the growing unrest. "This is unacceptable. She's being targeted. Why is this still happening?" Ava sat silently, her gaze steady, letting the moment build around her. This wasn't just about her anymore, it had become something larger. A collective recognition of the quiet injustices that so often went unchallenged. The fault lines of privilege and prejudice, usually hidden beneath the surface, were now exposed for everyone to see. In the midst of the commotion, a man from coach stepped into the first-class cabin. Michael Rivera, still holding his phone, raised his voice above the din. "This is all being recorded," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "Every word, every action. The whole world is going to see how this airline treats its passengers." Rachel's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. She turned sharply toward Michael, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately." Michael didn't budge. "I think I'll stay right here," he said. "Someone has to document this." The captain appeared at the front of the cabin, his expression a mask of frustration and weariness. He held up a hand, signaling for silence. The murmurs quieted, though the tension remained thick in the air. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, his voice steady but strained. "I understand there's been a situation involving one of our passengers. I'd like to assure you that we are handling it." Ava stood then, slowly and deliberately, her movement drawing every eye in the cabin. She turned to face the captain, her posture commanding but calm. "With all due respect, Captain," she said, her voice carrying the weight of everything left unsaid. "You're not handling it, you're enabling it." The cabin fell silent again, her words cutting through the noise like a blade. The captain's expression faltered, the authority in his stance softening under her steady gaze. "I've been harassed since I boarded this plane," Ava continued, her tone measured but resolute. "Not because I did anything wrong, but because of the assumptions made about who I am and where I belong. And you've allowed it to happen." The passengers watched, their attention fixed on Ava as her words hung in the air. Even those who had remained silent earlier seemed to lean in now, drawn by the quiet power of her voice. "This isn't just about me," Ava said, her gaze sweeping the cabin. "It's about the unspoken rules that allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It's about the way power is used to silence and dismiss those who challenge it. And it's about the choices we all make, whether to stand by and watch, or to speak up." A ripple of agreement moved through the cabin, passengers nodding and murmuring their support. The older woman who had spoken up earlier stood again, her voice clear and strong. "She's right," the woman said, addressing the captain directly. "You need to take responsibility for what's happening here." The captain hesitated, his authority slipping further under the weight of the passengers' voices. He glanced at Rachel, whose face had gone pale, then back at Ava. "Miss Mitchell," he said finally, his tone softening, "I'd like to apologize for any distress you've experienced. It was never our intention to make you feel unwelcome." Ava held his gaze, her expression unyielding. "An apology isn't enough," she said. "What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again?" The captain's face tightened, his discomfort visible. "I'll ensure that this incident is thoroughly reviewed," he said, "and I'll personally see to it that you're compensated for your experience." "That's a start," Ava said, her voice firm, "but it's not the end." The captain nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of the moment. "Understood," he said. "We'll make it right." As he turned and walked back toward the cockpit, the cabin seemed to exhale all at once. The tension lingered, but it was no longer suffocating. Ava sat down slowly, her posture still upright, her gaze fixed ahead. The battle wasn't over. It would continue in boardrooms and courtrooms, in conversations and headlines, in all the spaces where power was wielded and challenged. But for now, Ava had won this round. And she knew, deep in her bones, that this victory belonged not just to her, but to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The plane hummed on, cutting through the clouds, carrying its passengers toward a horizon that now seemed just a little brighter. The plane cruised at 30,000 feet, its engines humming like the low growl of an animal lying in wait. In the first-class cabin, the tension had become an unspoken participant, its presence unmistakable and unyielding. Ava Mitchell sat upright in her seat, her posture as deliberate as her silence. She wasn't merely sitting, she was holding her ground. And that ground had become more contested with every passing minute. Across the aisle, a man folded his newspaper with slow precision, his eyes darting toward Ava. His expression was carefully blank, but his movements betrayed him. He wasn't just curious, he was studying her, weighing her presence in this space as though the mere act of sitting in first class was an act of defiance. Ava ignored him. She was used to this calculus. The way her existence seemed to demand justification in certain spaces. But being used to something didn't make it less exhausting. The flight attendant, Rachel Turner, stood at the galley, her back turned to the cabin as she whispered urgently to her younger colleague. Rachel's body language radiated frustration, stiff shoulders, a clipboard clutched tightly in her hands, the faint tremor of someone who felt their control slipping. Ava couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She knew the tone, the pitch of a conversation that wasn't about logistics or policy but about power and how to wield it against someone who refused to yield. Rachel turned suddenly, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she strode back into the cabin. Her expression was set, a mask of professionalism that barely concealed the storm brewing beneath. She stopped in front of Ava's seat, her presence casting a shadow over the quiet defiance that Ava projected like armor. "Miss Mitchell," Rachel began, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "I've just spoken with the captain, and he's authorized me to address this situation directly. For the comfort and safety of all passengers, I must ask you to comply with crew instructions." Ava raised her eyes slowly, meeting Rachel's gaze with a calm that only seemed to unnerve her further. "I am complying," Ava said evenly. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for. I'm not disrupting anyone." Rachel's jaw tightened, her professionalism beginning to fray. "This isn't about the seat anymore," she said, her voice sharper now. "Your refusal to cooperate is creating unnecessary tension. I need you to move to the main cabin." "Tension?" Ava repeated, her voice calm but cutting. "The only tension here is the one you've created by singling me out." The words landed like a strike, and Rachel's face flushed. She shifted on her feet, glancing around as if searching for backup. The younger flight attendant stood a few rows away, her expression conflicted but unwilling to intervene. "I'm simply following procedure," Rachel said, her voice faltering slightly. "We can't allow disruptions to escalate." "Disruptions?" Ava's tone sharpened, and her gaze narrowed. "Let me ask you something. If I were a man in a business suit, would you still be questioning my seat? If I didn't look the way I do, would we even be having this conversation?" Rachel's face reddened further, her eyes darting around the cabin as murmurs began to spread among the passengers. Ava's words had punctured the facade, exposing the quiet undercurrent of bias that everyone had felt but no one had named until now. From the row behind Ava, a woman's voice broke through the rising tension. "She's right," the woman said, her tone clear and resolute. "We've all been watching this. And it's obvious what's happening." Rachel turned sharply, her composure slipping as she faced the woman. "Ma'am, this is a private matter," she said, her voice tight with strain. "Private?" The woman raised an eyebrow, her expression incredulous. You've been making this as public as possible since it started. And for what? To humiliate her? Because it's not working. The murmurs grew louder now, rippling through the cabin like a wave. Passengers leaned toward one another, their whispers charged with indignation or discomfort. Some nodded in agreement with the woman, while others looked away, unwilling to engage. The divide was palpable, cutting across invisible lines of complicity and accountability. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line, her grip on the clipboard tightening. I don't need to explain myself to you, she said, her voice brittle. I'm doing my job, and I'm doing mine, Ava said, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of unspoken history. My job is to exist in this space, even when people like you would prefer I didn't. The words hit with quiet force, drawing an audible gasp from somewhere in the cabin. Ava didn't turn to see who it was. Her focus remained on Rachel, whose expression had hardened into something unreadable, part anger, part fear, part something more fragile that she couldn't quite conceal. The captain appeared then, his presence drawing a hush over the cabin. He moved with the deliberate calm of someone accustomed to diffusing conflicts. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of weariness. He stopped beside Rachel, his gaze shifting briefly to Ava before settling on the younger flight attendant. What's the situation here? He asked, his tone measured but firm. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but Ava spoke first. The situation, she said, is that your flight attendant has spent this entire flight targeting me. I'm sitting in the seat I purchased, and I'm not moving. The captain's brow furrowed, and he glanced at Rachel for clarification. But before she could speak, the woman from the row behind Ava stood again. She's telling the truth, the woman said. I've seen everything. Your flight attendant has been out of line since the beginning. Rachel turned on the woman, her professionalism unraveling completely. This is none of your business, she snapped, her voice rising. It's everyone's business, the woman shot back, because we all see what's happening here, and we're not okay with it. The captain held up a hand, signaling for silence. He turned back to Ava, his expression unreadable but his tone conciliatory. Miss Mitchell, he said, I apologize for any misunderstanding. You're welcome to remain in your seat. Rachel stiffened, her face pale and tight. But she said nothing. The murmurs in the cabin swelled again, louder this time, as passengers began to voice their agreement. The younger flight attendant stepped back, her eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold. Ava exhaled slowly, the weight in her chest easing slightly. She nodded at the captain but said nothing more. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, she had claimed a small victory, and she would carry it with her for the rest of the flight. As the captain and Rachel retreated, the cabin began to settle, but the air still felt charged. The quiet broken not by words but by the shared understanding of what had just transpired. Ava leaned back in her seat, her gaze fixed ahead. She wasn't just a passenger anymore, she was a witness. A participant in a larger reckoning that had unfolded at 30,000 feet. And she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The flight pressed on, its altitude steady, but the cabin was anything but tranquil. The hum of the engines had faded into the background, replaced by the uneasy rhythm of murmurs and the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. Ava Mitchell sat still, her posture as unwavering as her resolve. But beneath her calm surface, a storm brewed, a lifetime of battles fought in spaces like this, where power was often wielded quietly but ruthlessly, through the rules people didn't speak of but always enforced. The younger flight attendant, who had been lingering near the galley, approached Ava cautiously. Her steps were hesitant, her expression conflicted. She held a tray with a fresh glass of water, the gesture a clear attempt at reconciliation or perhaps appeasement. Here you go, ma'am, the attendant said softly, setting the glass down on Ava's tray table. Ava studied her for a moment, her gaze calm but probing. Thank you, she said, her voice neutral. The attendant lingered for a second too long, as if she wanted to say something more but didn't know how. Then she turned and walked away, her shoulders slightly hunched. Ava watched her retreat, wondering whether the gesture had been motivated by guilt or by fear of further fallout. Either way, it felt hollow, a band-aid over a wound too deep to ignore. Across the aisle, a businessman cleared his throat, his eyes darting toward Ava. You know, he began hesitantly, these things usually blow over if you just let them. Ava turned her head slowly, fixing him with a gaze that made him falter. "Let them?" she repeated, her tone even but edged with quiet steel. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to back down. "I just mean it's not worth the trouble. Sometimes it's easier to move on." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their implications. Ava felt the familiar sting of that refrain, the subtle demand to be silent, to shrink, to let others dictate the terms of her existence. "Easier for whom?" Ava asked, her voice cutting through the man's hesitation like a blade. "For you? For her? For everyone who doesn't have to live with the consequences?" The businessman flushed, his eyes dropping to his lap. He didn't respond, and Ava didn't press him. She knew his kind well-meaning, perhaps, but blind to the ways their comfort depended on her erasure. It wasn't malice that drove them, but indifference, which was often worse. A few rows back, a voice broke the uneasy quiet. "She's right," said the older woman who had spoken up earlier. Her tone was firm, unyielding. "People like her," she nodded toward Ava, "are always expected to just let things go." "But why should they? Why should she?" The businessman shifted again, visibly squirming under the weight of the woman's words. Ava offered her a small, grateful nod, but the moment was short-lived. Rachel Turner reappeared, her steps hurried and her expression tense. She had retreated to the galley earlier, likely to regroup, and now she returned with a fresh veneer of professionalism. "Miss Mitchell," Rachel said, her voice loud enough to reclaim the cabin's attention. "The captain has asked me to speak with you one final time. If you refuse to comply, we'll have no choice but to involve airport security upon landing." Ava's patience, already worn thin, finally snapped. She stood, her movements slow but deliberate, commanding the attention of everyone around her. "You keep saying, comply," Ava said, her voice steady but rising with each word. "But what you mean is, submit. What you mean is that I should step aside and make myself small because it makes you more comfortable." Rachel froze, her grip on the clipboard tightening. "That's not." "Don't lie," Ava interrupted, her tone sharp. "Not to me, not to yourself, and not to them." She gestured toward the other passengers, many of whom were now openly watching the confrontation. "This isn't about procedure. It's about power, and the fact that I refuse to let you take it from me." The cabin was silent, the weight of Ava's words pressing down on everyone like a heavy blanket. Rachel's face flushed, her composure crumbling under the collective gaze of the passengers. For a moment, it seemed as though she might snap back, but instead, she spun on her heel and marched toward the galley, her retreat a tacit admission of defeat. Ava sat down again, her heart pounding but her expression calm. Around her, the passengers began to murmur, their whispers carrying a mix of admiration, discomfort, and quiet indignation. Some looked at Ava with newfound respect, while others avoided her gaze entirely, unwilling to confront the truths her presence had laid bare. Michael Rivera, the man who had been filming earlier, stood and approached Ava's seat. He leaned down slightly, his voice low but insistent. "I got it all," he said, nodding toward his phone. "If they try anything else, they'll regret it." Ava met his gaze, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's not just for you," Michael replied. "It's for everyone who's had to deal with this and couldn't fight back." As he returned to his seat, Ava leaned back and closed her eyes. She felt the weight of the moment settling over her, not just the exhaustion of the battle but the quiet hope that something larger was shifting. The fault lines of prejudice and power had been exposed, and they could no longer be ignored. But Ava knew this wasn't the end. The real fight would come later. In boardrooms and courtrooms, in headlines and hashtags, in the quiet but relentless push for accountability. For now, she would sit in her seat, unbowed and unbroken, knowing that her defiance had cracked something open. The plane continued its journey, cutting through the clouds, carrying its passengers toward an uncertain horizon. Ava stared out the window, the vast sky stretching endlessly before her, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, there was still room to rise. The final hour of the flight unfolded like the climax of a slow-building storm. The tension, carefully restrained until now, broke loose, revealing the fractures that had been there all along. Ava Mitchell remained seated, her calm a deliberate act of defiance. Around her, the first-class cabin had transformed from a place of quiet luxury into a theater of exposed prejudice. With every passenger a reluctant witness, Rachel Turner had disappeared into the galley, her authority in tatters, but Ava knew the battle wasn't over. It was never over, not in a world where people like Rachel had the privilege of retreating while those like Ava carried the weight of the conflict long after the moment passed. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into Los Angeles shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and tray tables are secured." His tone was calm, practiced, but it did little to soothe the undercurrent of unease that had taken hold of the cabin. Michael Rivera, the man who had been filming earlier, leaned toward Ava from his seat in coach. "They're going to try something when we land," he said quietly. "You need to be ready." Ava gave him a small nod. She was ready. She had been ready long before she boarded this flight. Long before Rachel's hostility had forced her to defend her right to exist in a space she had every right to occupy. This wasn't just about her seat. It never had been. It was about the unspoken rules that shaped the lives of people like her. Rules enforced not with outright violence but with the quiet, relentless erosion of dignity. The plane began its descent, the cabin filling with the low rumble of turbulence. Ava's grip on the armrest tightened, but her expression remained serene. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their gazes a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and among a few a quiet sense of solidarity. Then Rachel reappeared. She walked slowly down the aisle, her clipboard gone and her expression unreadable. The passengers fell silent as she approached Ava's seat, her body language betraying the strain of a conflict she could no longer control. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but it carried the same edge of forced authority. "Miss Mitchell," Rachel said, her tone clipped but faltering. "Security has been notified. They'll meet us at the gate to address this situation." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. The businessman across the aisle shook his head in disbelief, while the older woman who had spoken up earlier let out an audible gasp. Ava didn't flinch. "What situation?" Ava asked, her voice calm but cutting. "The one where I'm sitting in the seat I paid for? Or the one where you've gone out of your way to humiliate me?" Rachel's face flushed, but she said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, until Michael spoke up from behind. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice firm and steady. "Everyone here knows what's happening. You're targeting her, plain and simple." Rachel spun around, her composure slipping further. "Sir, I suggest you stay out of this," she said sharply, but her voice lacked conviction, and the weight of the passengers' stares seemed to bear down on her. The older woman stood up again, her voice ringing through the cabin. "No, he's right," she said. "We've all seen it, and we're not going to pretend we haven't." The murmurs grew louder, voices rising in agreement. Some passengers nodded, while others clapped softly, their gestures small but significant. Rachel's face crumpled, her authority crumbling under the weight of collective resistance. At that moment, the captain emerged from the cockpit. His face was tense, his movements deliberate as he approached Ava's seat. He looked at her, then at Rachel, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and irritation. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his tone measured, "on behalf of the airline, I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced during this flight." Ava raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "An apology is a start," she said, "but it's not enough." The captain nodded slowly, his eyes flicking toward Rachel. "I understand," he said. "We'll address this matter with the crew once we've landed." Rachel stiffened, her face pale, but she didn't speak. The captain turned back to Ava. "For now, I'd like to ensure a smooth landing. Is there anything we can do to make you more comfortable?" Ava tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "You can start by letting your crew know that passengers like me aren't optional," she said. "We don't disappear just because it's inconvenient for you to see us." The captain's face tightened, but he nodded. "Understood," he said quietly, before turning and walking back toward the cockpit. As the plane landed and taxied to the gate, the cabin was heavy with silence. The tension hadn't dissipated, it had merely shifted, settling over the passengers like a storm cloud. Ava remained seated, her posture unyielding, as the plane came to a stop. When the doors opened, two security officers waited at the end of the jet bridge. They looked at Ava, then at Rachel, their expressions neutral but expectant. Michael stood nearby, his phone in hand, ready to record whatever came next. But nothing happened. The passengers began to disembark, their movements slow and deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of what they had witnessed. Some paused to offer Ava a nod or word of support. Others avoided her gaze entirely, their discomfort palpable. As Ava stepped off the plane, she felt the eyes of the security officers on her, but they said nothing. Rachel lingered near the gate, her face a mask of barely concealed frustration. Ava didn't look at her. Outside, Michael caught up to Ava, his expression a mix of admiration and resolve. "You handled that better than most people would have," he said. Ava shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It's not about handling it," she said. "It's about refusing to let it handle me." Michael nodded, his phone still in hand. "This story isn't over," he said. "People are going to hear about this." Ava met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Good," she said. "Let them." As she walked away, the Los Angeles air hit her like a promise, a reminder that the fight was far from over. But so was her resolve. She had faced the quiet violence of prejudice and power, and she had emerged unbroken. And she knew, in her heart, that her fight wasn't just her own. It was for everyone who had been told, in ways both loud and quiet, that they didn't belong. It was for a future where they didn't have to fight at all. The airport terminal was a flurry of movement, travelers rushing to their gates, children tugging at tired parents, announcements echoing overhead. Yet within this chaos, Ava Mitchell stood still, a figure of deliberate calm. Her resolve hadn't faltered, but the events of the flight lingered in her mind like a bruised tender, aching and impossible to ignore. Michael Rivera walked beside her, his phone still in hand. His presence was steady, a quiet reassurance that she wasn't facing this alone. "The footage is already gaining traction," he said, his voice low but urgent. "People are sharing it. They're angry. Ava, they see what happened to you." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "They see one piece of it," she replied. "But will they see the rest? Will they see what lies underneath?" Michael hesitated, sensing the weight of her words. "What do you mean?" Ava stopped walking and turned to face him. Her voice, though quiet, carried the force of a lifetime's worth of truths. "This wasn't just about Rachel. It wasn't just about me. It's about the unspoken rules that govern spaces like that, plain rules that decide who belongs and who doesn't. Rules that don't need to be written because they're enforced in every glance, every tone, every assumption." Michael's gaze didn't waver. "That's why we keep going," he said. "That's why we make them see it." Ava allowed herself a small, grateful smile. "Let's hope they're ready to look." The airline's customer service desk loomed ahead, a sleek counter staffed by workers who wore the same polished smiles as Rachel Turner. Ava could see the discomfort flicker in their eyes as she approached, her presence a silent disruption to their practiced routine. Michael stayed a few steps behind, his phone discreetly capturing every moment. "I'd like to file a formal complaint," Ava said, her tone polite but firm. The attendant, a young woman with neatly tied hair, nodded quickly. "Of course, ma'am. If you could just fill out this form." Ava raised an eyebrow, her voice sharpening just enough to command attention. "I'm not here for paperwork. I'd like to speak with someone from management." The attendant hesitated, her smile faltering. "Ma'am, we'll be happy to escalate your concern. But I assure you this form is a way to keep me quiet." Ava interrupted, her gaze steady. "I've been quiet enough. Now, if you won't call a manager, I'll wait here until you do." Passengers passing through the terminal began to slow, their curious glances drawn to the unfolding scene. The attendant's face flushed, and she reached for the phone. Moments later, a man in a tailored suit approached, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm Michael Harris, regional manager," he said, extending a hand that Ava did not take. "I understand there's been an issue?" "I'd call it more than an issue," Ava replied, her voice measured. "Your flight attendant went out of her way to harass me for the simple fact that I exist in a space she didn't think I belonged in." Michael's expression didn't change, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his discomfort. "I apologize if you felt targeted, Miss Mitchell," he began, his tone conciliatory. "We take these matters very seriously." "No," Ava said, cutting him off. "You don't. If you did, this wouldn't have happened. If you did, people like me wouldn't have to fight for the bare minimum of respect every time we step into spaces like your first-class cabin." Around them, the small crowd that had gathered began to murmur. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Ava could feel their eyes on her, but she refused to let their reactions dictate her words. "I'm not here for your corporate apology," Ava continued. her voice rising slightly. "I'm here to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to the next person who looks like me or to the one after that." Michael shifted, his practiced professionalism beginning to crack under the weight of her words. "We are committed to addressing any discrimination within our operations," he said, "but these things take time." "And in the meantime?" Ava asked, her tone sharp. "You expect us to endure? To wait patiently while you figure out how to fix something you've allowed to fester for years?" Michael hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. Ava held his gaze, unflinching, until he finally looked away. By the time Ava left the counter, her complaint officially filed, the video Michael had recorded was already making waves. Social media buzzed with outrage, the footage spreading like wildfire. But Ava knew the real battle wouldn't be fought online, it would be fought in boardrooms and courtrooms. In the slow, grinding machinery of accountability, as she walked through the terminal, her phone buzzed with notifications. Messages of support flooded in, alongside interview requests from journalists eager to amplify her story. Ava read them with a mix of gratitude and weariness. She appreciated the solidarity, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that this moment, like so many before it, might fade too quickly into the background. Michael caught up to her, his expression serious. "The airline's already put out a statement," he said, handing her his phone. The screen displayed a carefully worded apology, full of vague assurances about diversity training and internal reviews. "They think this will be enough," Ava said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "They think a few pretty words will make people forget." Michael nodded. "But people aren't forgetting this time. They're watching." Ava looked out at the terminal, at the faces of travelers rushing past her. Some looked like her, most didn't. And she wondered how many of them had their own stories, moments when they'd been made to feel small, invisible, or unwelcome, moments when the quiet violence of prejudice had left its mark. "This isn't just about me," Ava said finally. "It's about all of us. And if they're watching, then we have to give them something they can't ignore." As Ava boarded her connecting flight, the hum of determination in her chest drowned out the lingering echoes of the day's events. She had won a small victory. But the fight wasn't over. It never was. The rules she had challenged weren't written in manuals or policies, they were etched into the fabric of everyday life. Enforced through glances, words, and actions too subtle to name but too powerful to deny. And yet, as the plane rose into the sky, Ava felt something she hadn't expected: hope. Not the naive kind that ignored the weight of history, but the kind born of struggle, the hope that, with enough voices, those unspoken rules could be rewritten. The flight attendant approached her with a drink, her smile warm but cautious. "Here you go, Miss Mitchell," she said softly. Ava nodded, her voice calm. "Thank you." For the first time that day, no one questioned her presence. And that, Ava thought, was a start. Not the end, but a start. The headlines were relentless. Passenger claims discrimination on airline. Video goes viral. Harassment in first class sparks national debate. Flying while black. Ava Mitchell's stand becomes a movement. Ava Mitchell's story, captured by Michael Rivera's camera, had ignited a firestorm. What had begun as an incident in the sky had grown into something far larger, reckoning with the quiet, pervasive racism that many wanted to believe no longer existed. But Ava wasn't naive. She had lived long enough to know how quickly the world could turn its attention elsewhere. She had watched movements swell and then fade, their momentum stifled by fatigue or willful ignorance. And she knew that those in power often counted on this, on the public's short memory, on the comfort of forgetting. Yet here she stood, unwavering, as she prepared to meet with the airline's legal team. The confrontation she had faced in the air had been visceral, personal. What awaited her now was colder, more calculated. A room full of lawyers and executives, all determined to protect their bottom line. Ava straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the people who had come before her and the ones who would come after. The conference room was a stark contrast to the chaos of the airport. The table was polished, the lighting muted, the air heavy with the quiet tension of corporate diplomacy. Ava sat across from a row of suits, their faces carefully blank. At the head of the table sat Rachel Bennett, the airline's lead counsel, her expression calm but watchful. "We want to express our sincerest apologies, Miss Mitchell," Bennett began, her voice smooth and measured. "The experience you endured does not reflect the values of our company. Ava leaned forward, her gaze sharp. Your values allowed it to happen, she said, so spare me the scripted apology. What are you actually going to do about it? Bennett's composure flickered, but she recovered quickly. We're prepared to offer a substantial settlement, she said, sliding a folder across the table. In addition, we're committing to mandatory diversity training for our employees and an internal review of our policies. Ava opened the folder, scanning the offer. The amount was significant enough to tempt anyone looking for an easy resolution. But Ava's lips tightened as she read the accompanying clause. This settlement is contingent upon a non-disclosure agreement. She closed the folder and set it aside. So, you want me to take the money and stay silent? She said, her tone cold. You want me to let you sweep this under the rug and pretend it never happened? Bennett's expression hardened. Miss Mitchell, this settlement is intended to make things right. A prolonged legal battle would be costly for both sides. And who pays the real cost? Ava shot back. The next person who's treated like I was? The ones who don't have a camera to document it or a platform to amplify their story. The room fell silent. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, their polished facades cracking under the weight of her words. This isn't just about me, Ava continued, her voice rising with quiet power. This is about a culture that devalues people like me. A culture that tells us, over and over, that we don't belong until we start to believe it ourselves. The silence was broken by the sharp buzz of Ava's phone. She glanced at the screen. Another notification. Her story was still spreading. The video shared millions of times, accompanied by hashtags calling for accountability. Voices from across the country had joined hers, each one adding to the growing chorus demanding change. Bennett shifted in her seat, her discomfort palpable. What would you propose, Miss Mitchell? She asked. Her tone clipped. Ava met her gaze, unflinching. Transparency, she said, an independent investigation into your practices. Public accountability for what happened to me and for the patterns of behavior you've ignored for years. And a commitment to real, measurable change not just for your employees, but for the entire industry. Bennett's jaw tightened, and one of the executives leaned forward, his voice tinged with irritation. You're asking for a lot. No, Ava replied, her tone steady. I'm asking for what should already exist. By the time the meeting ended, the atmosphere in the room was fractured. The veneer of control shattered by Ava's unyielding presence. The airline's representatives had promised to review her demands, but Ava knew this fight wouldn't be settled in a single meeting. It was a battle of attrition, and she was prepared to see it through. Outside the conference room, Michael was waiting, his phone in hand. How'd it go? He asked. They're scared, Ava said simply. And they should be. Michael smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. The video's still gaining traction. People are rallying behind you. Ava, this is bigger than just one flight. She nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. It was bigger than her. But that didn't make it any less personal. Every step she took was for the little girl she once was, the one who had learned too young that the world would always try to make her smaller. The days that followed were a blur of interviews, meetings, and public statements. Ava's story became a flashpoint, a catalyst for conversations that had been avoided for too long. Civil rights organizations reached out, offering their support. Former airline employees came forward with their own stories, their voices adding fuel to the fire. But with the attention came resistance. The airline's PR machine worked overtime, releasing carefully worded statements that framed Ava's experience as an isolated incident. Anonymous commenters flooded her social media with vitriol, their words a reminder of how deeply rooted the problem was. Still, Ava pressed on. She wasn't fighting for approval or recognition. She was fighting for the truth and for the hope that, one day, the truth might finally be enough. Weeks later, as Ava stood before a crowd at a rally organized in her honor, she felt the weight of the moment. The faces before her were a tapestry of ages, races, and experiences. Some carried signs with her name, while others held images of their own loved ones victims of prejudice and silence. Ava stepped to the microphone, her voice steady but charged with emotion. This isn't about me, she began. It's about all of us. It's about the systems that tell us who we can be, where we can go, and what we're worth. It's about the unspoken rules that govern our lives and the choice to stop obeying them. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices a thunderous affirmation of her words. Ava felt a swell of something she hadn't expected: hope. Not the fragile kind that relied on the promises of others, but the kind that was born of action and unity. As the applause died down, Ava spoke again, her voice firm. Change doesn't come easily. It doesn't come quietly. And it doesn't come without resistance. But it does come. If we stand together, if we refuse to be silent, it will come. The crowd roared, their voices rising like a wave. And for the first time in a long time, Ava believed them. She stepped back from the microphone, her heart full. This fight wasn't over, it might never be over. But for now, she had found her place within it. Not as a victim, but as a force, as a voice, as a reminder that even in the face of silence, resistance could echo loud enough to change the world. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.